Paul wiped his forehead, his hand lingering near the faint imprint of the security camera that once hung in the corner of his living room. The tiny mount was still visible on the wall, even though he had removed the device a few weeks ago. It was a constant reminder of the last time he was caught on camera wearing a flowing dress, complete with all the accessories he'd carefully collected over the years. The memories of that moment still made his cheeks flare with heat whenever he replayed the scene in his mind. He had felt simultaneously shocked, exposed, and oddly relieved when the footage came to light. It had been an intense conversation with his wife, Sandra, but they had reached a tentative resolution to keep lines of communication open. At least for a while, he thought he had safeguarded his secret once again. He had not expected to need a new camera in the house, certainly not so soon after the security camera incident. But here he was, browsing through an online pet store's selection of monitoring devices, with Sandra standing behind him. Ever since their newly adopted dog, Milo, had begun exhibiting serious anxiety whenever he and Sandra left the house, the suggestion of a pet cam came up multiple times. Sandra had been the first to notice how Milo would whimper and scratch at the door for an hour after they left. At the veterinarian's recommendation, they had decided to observe Milo's midday behavior to see if there were any triggers or ways they could soothe him remotely. "I know you're worried about installing another camera," Sandra said softly, her voice just behind Paul's shoulder. She had watched him hover the mouse cursor indecisively over the product images on her laptop. "But we really need to keep an eye on Milo. He's been so anxious, and maybe if we can see what sets him off, we can help." Paul nodded, feeling the tension rise. He gripped the edges of the kitchen table. "I'm not thrilled about cameras, obviously," he said, voice wavering slightly. He remembered all too well how, just a couple of months ago, he had gotten comfortable in front of what he believed was a disabled system. He had spent a quiet afternoon at home, wearing a patterned skirt and a matching blouse, reading a fashion magazine he had subscribed to under a pseudonym. It had been a rare moment of peace, until he discovered that his wife had innocently watched a portion of that live feed on her phone, leading to an awkward confrontation. Sandra stepped closer, slipping a reassuring arm around his shoulder. "We'll set it up in the living room, aimed at Milo's favorite spot near the sofa. That's all. It's for the dog. If it makes you too uncomfortable, we'll figure something else out. But honey, I really think this will help." He took a deep breath, gazing at the screen. His heart pounded. Every rational part of him knew this was the right decision for Milo. The poor dog had been rescued from a precarious situation, and it was up to them to make him feel safe. Paul also knew he needed to show Sandra that he trusted her, that he was willing to cooperate with something that mattered to both of them. "Let's do it," he said finally, clicking the Add to Cart button. "But I'm turning it off whenever we're home together. I can't stand the idea of being recorded again. Just promise me we'll keep it off unless we're both out." Sandra nodded. "Of course. I don't want you feeling paranoid. We'll only switch it on remotely when we're out of the house so I can check the feed on my phone." They both exhaled, a subtle wave of relief spreading between them as if they had struck a balance. They completed the order, and Paul braced himself for the arrival of this new camera. A week later, the pet cam arrived in a discreet box. It was more compact than Paul anticipated, a small orb-like device with a wide-angle lens, easily mountable with adhesive strips. Sandra insisted that it should be placed on the lower shelf of their entertainment console, somewhere Milo couldn't knock it over, pointing toward his usual spot by the couch. For the next several days, Paul felt his breathing catch each time he walked past it. Its small light remained off, except for those times he and Sandra left the house, when Sandra would quickly turn it on via her phone to check on Milo. The system worked well, at least from what Sandra told him. Paul didn't want to see the app or the live feed. He forced himself to trust Sandra's sense of discretion. During the first few remote checks, she saw Milo circling the living room, pacing back and forth and whimpering occasionally. She talked to him through the device's built-in microphone, her voice coming out a little distorted, but comforting enough to calm the dog. Over time, Milo grew more used to their occasional absences, and the camera provided a sense of relief. Paul, for the most part, tried to pretend that it didn't exist. One Thursday afternoon, Paul had a shorter work shift. Sandra had an all-day conference she had to attend. As Paul pulled up to the driveway, Milo greeted him at the front window with a wagging tail and a high-pitched bark. Paul let himself inside and bent down to scratch Milo behind the ears. The dog relaxed almost instantly, trotting toward his water bowl as Paul set down his briefcase. With the house empty and the day's demands behind him, Paul's shoulders loosened. His mind drifted to the outfit he had placed in the back of his closet. A new top in a rich plum color he'd found on sale a few weeks back, along with a matching pencil skirt. He had been longing to try them on in comfort, without the residual fear that had haunted him since the last incident. Sandra wouldn't be home for hours, and the new pet cam was turned off unless Sandra manually activated it from her phone. He figured there was no reason for her to check on Milo when he was obviously with the dog at home. He had done a quick mental check. Sandra had no pressing reason to turn on the feed. Milo wasn't alone, so it was safe. He tiptoed into the bedroom, feeling the beginnings of that quiet thrill he always felt when slipping into his chosen attire. It was never about anything more than simply feeling tranquil, wearing something that he found pleasing. This was his personal routine to unwind. The closeness of the fabric around his body gave him a curious blend of calm and energy. He pinned up his hair, which was still short enough to look very much like a man's cut, but he had managed to train certain sections so that they had a bit more flow. He ran a brush through it, parted it carefully, and added a subtle hair clip. The mirror in the corner was tall enough for him to observe the entire outfit. Satisfied, he pivoted a few times, carefully adjusting any wrinkles in the skirt. He stopped for a moment and let out a contented sigh. "Hey, Milo," he called, stepping out of the bedroom. The dog had been relaxing in the corridor. Milo lifted his head, ears perked, curious. Paul crouched down to pet him again, one hand on the dog's back, reassuring him. "No need to be anxious, buddy. We're home together. Just me and you." Milo's tail wagged gently, and he followed Paul into the living room. Paul felt more at ease than he had in quite some time. This was a chance, however small, to inhabit what he privately referred to as Paula, the part of himself he could only express when he was alone, or when he wanted to be alone. He had ventured a partial conversation with Sandra about it after the last incident, but it was still such a delicate topic that they only circled around the edges of it. Although Sandra had not rejected him, the situation was complicated, sometimes laced with confusion and unspoken tension. He was still sorting out how to speak about it with her. For now, he limited these moments to times when he was absolutely sure he could be by himself. He moved to the sofa, picked up a fashion magazine that had arrived in a plain wrapper earlier that week, and began to flip through the pages. The sun cast lazy rectangles of light across the carpet. Milo lay by his feet, occasionally rolling onto his back to coax a belly rub. Paul couldn't help smiling at how tranquil the dog appeared compared to the worried creature he'd seen in old footage. As the afternoon light mellowed into a softer glow, Paul turned page after page, pausing to read an article here or there about a new collection debuting on runways in Europe. It was a place far removed from his own suburban life, but he enjoyed the window into that world. He lost track of time, lulled by the sense of security. What Paul did not realize was that Sandra, sitting in a small lounge at her conference during a lunch break, had her phone out. She was sipping coffee and trying to refocus after a particularly exhausting workshop. She began to wonder about Milo and how he was coping. Normally, she would not check the feed when she knew Paul was home. However, she also recalled the trainer's advice to observe the dog's interactions while other family members were present to see if Milo still showed any lingering nerves. Acting on a passing instinct, Sandra opened the pet cam app. She tapped to enable the feed, expecting to see nothing more than Paul typing away at his laptop or rummaging in the kitchen for a late lunch. The screen loaded. Sandra nearly spilled her coffee when the live image revealed Paul seated on the sofa, wearing a plum-colored top, a fitted skirt, and reading a magazine. The feed included audio, so she heard the faint rustle of pages being turned. Milo was lying contentedly by Paul's feet. Sandra quickly moved her phone closer to her chest, glancing around the conference lounge to ensure nobody could see the screen. Her heart pounded. She felt a faint tinge of déjà vu, reminiscent of the first time she'd discovered Paul in that other outfit via the previous camera system. She had told him then that it was all right, that they would talk about it. But she also recalled all the tension and confusion it had stirred up for them both. She lingered on the feed for a moment longer, watching how serene Paul appeared. It was rare to see him so at peace, leaning back with one leg crossed over the other, flipping through the glossy pages. He even wore small earrings, clip-ons, she realized. He was so engrossed that he didn't even look up or sense anything unusual. He must have forgotten the pet cam was now a permanent feature in the living room. The lens was so small, and from where he was seated, it would have seemed no more important than any other piece of modern decoration. After a moment, Sandra quietly ended the feed on her phone, her mind spinning. It was all so unexpected, yet oddly familiar. By the time Paul glanced at the clock, it was nearing 5 in the afternoon. Sandra would be home in a couple of hours, perhaps a bit later if traffic was bad. He gently placed the magazine aside, rose from the couch, and gave Milo another reassuring pat. "I guess I should probably change," he muttered. He smoothed the front of his skirt, feeling a mixture of regret and relief that his time as Paula was coming to an end for the day. In another life, he might have stayed in that outfit for the entire evening, but he didn't want to push any boundaries or create friction at home. It was safer to keep his routine private, though part of him still wished it could be more open. He was standing in the bedroom doorway when his phone buzzed. It was Sandra. He felt a jolt of panic, fleeting but real. He reminded himself that she was simply checking in. They texted daily about mundane matters, milk, dinner plans, errands. He glanced at the notification. "Hey, how's Milo doing? Everything okay?" Paul exhaled, ignoring the slight flutter of paranoia that always seemed to follow him since the last incident. "He's good," Paul texted back. "Just finishing up some reading. We'll probably take a short walk soon." He hovered for a moment, wondering if her question carried any hint of subtext. Then he shrugged it off and slipped back into the bedroom. With a delicate sense of routine, he took off the blouse and skirt, carefully folded them, and returned them to their storage space in the back of his closet. He unclipped the earrings and placed them in a small box on his nightstand. Then he put on a simple t-shirt and jeans, looked at himself in the mirror, and felt the last vestiges of that calm dissolve into the usual tension. "Well, it was a nice afternoon," he murmured. An hour later, he fed Milo, then clipped on a leash to take him out for a quick walk before Sandra's arrival. The sky was painted with evening's colors, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves. Milo seemed more at ease than ever, trotting along happily. Paul flashed a small smile at neighbors strolling by. He found an unexpected contentment in the routine, the quiet sense of normalcy. He and Milo returned home around the time Sandra texted that she was on her way. Paul busied himself with small chores, tidying the living room, washing a few dishes, until he heard the sound of Sandra's car in the driveway. She came in with a subdued smile that seemed a shade off from her usual bright greeting. He noticed she was trying to gauge his mood. He wondered if she was just exhausted from her conference. They went about their evening tasks, heating up leftovers, chatting about how the day had gone. Sandra mentioned the trainers at the conference, how they had recommended different methods for dealing with anxious pets. Paul gave the occasional nod, wondering why she kept glancing at him as if searching for something. They finished dinner, loaded the dishwasher, and moved to the couch to catch a brief show on television before bed. Halfway through an episode, Sandra leaned forward, muted the TV, and turned to Paul. "Can we talk for a minute?" she asked. His stomach flipped. He remembered this feeling, the quiet moment right before an important conversation, the one that required him to gather his courage. He nodded, switching off the TV entirely. "Sure." Sandra took a breath. "I know you probably turned off the camera after we came home, but earlier today, I checked on Milo from my phone during a break at the conference." She paused. She was choosing her words carefully. "I saw you." Paul's face went hot. He sat upright, gazing down at the coffee table. You did?" "Yes," she said, voice steady but calm. "You were on the sofa, dressed differently. I recognized the outfit." He swallowed. It felt like a lump had formed in his throat, and his heart hammered in his chest. Of all the fears he had regarding cameras, the worst had manifested for a second time. He couldn't even look at her. "I didn't realize you'd check the camera if Milo wasn't alone. I turned it off in my head. Forgot it was even there." Sandra reached out and placed a hand over his. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to invade your privacy. We've been trying to keep track of Milo's behavior even when one of us is home. The trainer said it might provide extra insight if we observe how he interacts with different family members. I didn't expect to see that." He slid his hand away, rubbed his forehead, and tried to breathe. "I understand. You didn't do anything wrong. It's your house too, and we both decided the camera was for Milo. I should have been more aware." He let out a humorless laugh. "I guess I forgot the whole point is that you can turn the feed on any time." They let the silence linger for a moment. Milo lay curled up on a nearby dog bed, oblivious to the tension in the air. Sandra cleared her throat gently. "I know how we left things last time," she began. "We agreed to try and keep communication open. I see now that you're still carrying a lot of worry. I'm not upset with you. Surprised, maybe, but not upset." Paul forced himself to look up. He searched her expression. She looked tired but not angry. He tried to form a coherent sentence. "It's something I do to feel at ease," he finally said, stumbling over his words. "I'm sorry if it bothers you." She shook her head. "It doesn't bother me. It's just that we haven't really talked about it. Not since the last time. I guess I'm wondering what's going on in that head of yours, and how you're feeling these days." He took another breath. The conversation he had been dreading since that first incident was happening again. But this time, Sandra's tone was quieter. Her eyes, though filled with questions, held a glimmer of understanding. "I feel calmer when I dress like that sometimes," he confessed. "It's not about you or us or anything I'm missing in our relationship. It's my own thing, that's all." Sandra nodded slowly. "I get that, and I'm not against it. I just need to know where we stand. Do you want more space to do this? Should we have different boundaries about the cameras, about the house?" She paused and glanced at the small pet cam on the lower shelf. "We installed that for Milo, but maybe we need a better system to protect your comfort." Paul ran a hand through his hair. "I don't want to remove it. I know it's helping Milo. I just need to remember that it can be on any time. So if I decide to wear different clothes around the house, I should go into the spare room or turn it away." He shrugged, feeling a wave of frustration. "But that just feels like hiding or sneaking around. I don't like that feeling either." Sandra's hand found his again. She squeezed gently. "Let's think this through. We can turn off the camera whenever either of us is home, but we'll leave it on a schedule while we're away. I'll promise not to check the feed if I know you're the one at home, and if there's any chance I might need to turn it on, I'll text you first. Would that help?" He exhaled, feeling an odd tangle of relief and lingering embarrassment. "I think so," he said. "Thank you for being understanding." She gave him a small, sad smile. "I'm trying. Look, I know this isn't easy for you. It's not all that easy for me either, but the truth is, I'd rather talk about it than pretend it's not there." A silence fell again, more gentle than before. Paul noticed Milo stirring, as if sensing a lull in the conversation. The dog ambled over and nuzzled Paul's knee. Paul gave him a scratch behind the ears, grateful for the small comfort. When he looked back at Sandra, she gestured quietly to the dark television. "Should we finish our show, or do you want to keep talking?" He leaned back, rotating his shoulders to release some tension. "Let's watch," he said softly. "I think we've covered enough for tonight." Sandra clicked the remote, and the show resumed, but Paul's mind drifted. Occasionally he glanced sideways at Sandra, absorbing her presence. He couldn't quite describe the sense of vulnerability that mingled with relief, but he was thankful that, for the second time, she was not driving him away. That fact alone eased the knot in his stomach. The next few days passed with relative calm. Paul and Sandra resumed their usual schedules. Milo continued to improve, barking less and whimpering only when truly stressed. Paul noticed Sandra rarely reached for her phone when he was in the house, as if she had made a conscious effort to respect his boundaries. The cameras were still there, but a quiet arrangement formed. If Sandra needed to check on Milo, she would let Paul know, or do it only when the house was empty. It was a tacit compromise, unspoken yet understood. Yet beneath that surface calm, Paul felt a ripple of change in the air. At times, he caught Sandra studying him with a thoughtful gaze. Once, when they were cleaning up after dinner, she leaned over and asked if he ever felt like talking more about this. He had shaken his head, mumbling something about being fine. Even though he recognized her efforts, he wasn't entirely sure how to articulate what was on his mind. There was a whirlpool of conflicting emotions swirling inside him: relief, worry, embarrassment, cautious optimism. The conversation would need to happen eventually, but he did not know how to initiate it without stumbling over every word. On a Sunday morning, Sandra invited him to sit at the table with her after breakfast. "I've been thinking," she said, passing him a mug of coffee. "We've tiptoed around each other for a while now. Let's talk a little bit. No pressure, no big confrontation, just a talk." He stared at his coffee. The steam rose in soft curls. He nodded, bracing for whatever might come next. "Go ahead." She settled in her chair, resting her elbows on the table. "I just want to know how this started for you. You don't have to tell me every detail if you're not comfortable, but it might help me understand." He waited a few seconds, trying to compose a response. "I guess it's something I've tried on and off for a really long time," he said, voice low. "Before we met, actually. At first, I experimented with a few items in college. Tried on a roommate's jacket once, then later a friend's scarf and skirt. I liked how it felt, but I got scared that people would judge me, so I pushed it aside for a while. Then, after we got married, I started picking it up again in private moments. It's not that I ever wanted to hide it from you. but it just felt so complicated to explain. Sandra nodded, absorbing each word carefully. Did it help you feel less stressed? He hesitated, choosing his response. Yes, it does. It's relaxing. Part of it is the aesthetic. Part of it is just wearing what feels good. He fiddled with the coffee mug, not meeting her eyes. I never wanted to lie to you. It wasn't about trust. It was more about fear, I guess. Sandra exhaled gently. I understand that. I just wish you had felt safer telling me. I know it can feel like a lot, especially if you worry about how I'll react. She paused, watching him. Do you want to share these moments with me, or do you prefer to keep them private? Paul's shoulders tensed, as if weighed by the question. I don't know, he admitted. Sometimes I think it would be nice if I didn't have to pretend, but other times I'm not sure how it would change things between us. She reached out and covered his hand with hers. We don't have to figure it all out right now, but I want you to know that you don't have to hide. I'm here if you ever want to talk or show me. We can figure out what that looks like. He swallowed, surprised by how direct she was. He nodded wordlessly, still uncertain but grateful that she was meeting him in this difficult space. The tension in his chest eased slightly, replaced by cautious gratitude. They spent the rest of Sunday cleaning the house, doing laundry, and occasionally sharing small smiles. Paul found himself replaying Sandra's words in his head. You don't have to hide. The phrase remained with him, echoing every time he opened a closet or passed the mirror that had revealed Paula so many times. By midweek, Paul noticed changes in Sandra's behavior. She tried to be more communicative, checking in with him about small errands, letting him know when she'd be home. One evening, she casually mentioned that she'd be busy with friends on Saturday afternoon, and that if he had personal plans, she wouldn't barge in unannounced. The gentle euphemism made him chuckle awkwardly. It wasn't that he had scheduled an afternoon of wearing different clothes, but the open invitation was quietly reassuring. He decided not to plan anything, though. He still felt like he needed more time before he could comfortably share this side of himself without trembling. However, one moment that Friday evening made him reconsider. Sandra was preparing to take a bath, collecting towels from the linen closet. Paul had just finished folding laundry. They nearly bumped into each other in the hallway, and Sandra let out a small laugh. But as she stepped aside, her eyes flicked to a lace shawl that Paul had placed on top of the folded laundry pile. In a soft voice, she asked, "Is that yours?" Paul blushed, nodding. "Yes, I bought it online a while back. It's comfortable." Sandra lightly ran her fingers over the fabric. Then she met his gaze. "It's pretty," she said quietly, a hint of genuine admiration in her eyes. She handed it back to him, neither of them moving away. An awkward hush stretched between them for a few seconds. Then Sandra smiled in a shy, almost endearing way and said, "Well, I'll let you finish up." She retreated into the bathroom, leaving Paul standing in the hallway with the shawl in his hands. Though small, that exchange warmed him from within, sparking a curiosity about what it might be like to let her see him in some of his favorite clothes. He wasn't there yet, but the idea no longer seemed impossible. Over the weekend, Paul prepared to test that idea. Sandra had gone out to meet her friends for lunch and a bit of shopping. He found himself alone in the house with Milo, the afternoon sun filtering through the windows. His heart thudded in his chest as he approached the closet. The last time he'd dressed up on a relaxed weekend afternoon, he had discovered the new pet cam. This time, though, it was turned off. Sandra had texted him before leaving. "Camera's off. No need for me to check on Milo while you're there. If you go out later, turn it on if you want. If not, that's okay too." He appreciated the thoughtfulness, but that didn't fully erase the nerves. He gathered a simple outfit, a pair of comfortable leggings, and a casual long tunic top. If he did it, he wanted something cozy, unrestrictive, an outfit to lounge in, not to be on edge about. The motion felt more deliberate now, as if each piece of clothing weighed more in his hands. He dressed in the bedroom, carefully smoothing out any wrinkles, then took a moment to brush his hair back, letting the front hang over his forehead in a way that he found flattering. His reflection gave him pause. Despite everything, he felt a small sense of pride. He stepped into the living room, glancing at the small orb of the pet cam. The green status light was dimmed, indicating it was off. Even though he still felt a pinch of paranoia, he reminded himself that Sandra had given him this space. If she wanted to spy or unexpectedly check on him, she knew how he felt about that, and they had reached a better understanding. She wouldn't break that trust. As he relaxed on the sofa, Milo jumped up next to him. Still an unusual behavior for the dog, but a sign that he was warming up. Paul patted the cushion, letting Milo settle in. "You're such a good boy," Paul murmured with a smile. He picked up the TV remote and idly flipped through a few channels. For once, he felt calm. The afternoon drifted by, quiet and pleasant. When Sandra returned that evening, Paul had already changed back into regular clothes. He greeted her at the door, noticing she held a shopping bag in one hand. She set down her purse, kicked off her shoes, and rummaged in the bag for a moment. She produced 2 scarves, both in warm autumnal shades. "I found these on sale," she explained, handing one to Paul. "I thought maybe you could use one if you like it." Paul looked at the scarf, a soft burgundy piece that felt luxurious between his fingers. He tried to say something, but his voice caught in his throat. Sandra saw the flicker of emotion in his eyes and said, "No pressure. If it's not your style, I can return it or keep it myself. But I figured you might enjoy having something that wasn't hidden away or that you had to sneak in. You know, something we both know is yours." His cheeks warmed, and he gave her a tentative smile. "Thank you. I like it." She nodded, her eyes brightening. "I'm glad." There was no big fanfare or drawn-out conversation after that. She simply placed the scarf in his hands, and he draped it over one arm, feeling the gentle weight of the fabric and the significance of the gesture. Life continued in that fashion. Little moments of mutual understanding, small acknowledgments of the private side of Paul's dressing habits. Meanwhile, Milo grew ever more confident, especially once he realized that sometimes, even if Paul was sporting a tunic or a skirt around the house, the dog would still be walked, fed, and played with in exactly the same way. Eventually, Paul overcame the dread of the pet cam. He and Sandra agreed on a strict schedule for it, on only when both were out of the house, except for occasional random checks with prior warnings. It was a compromise that allowed them to help the dog while respecting Paul's comfort. Though he appreciated how Sandra was handling it, Paul couldn't help feeling a bit on edge whenever the possibility of the camera came up. Some nights he would wake up at 2 a.m. and stare into the dark, recalling the moment he found out she'd inadvertently caught him again. But as the weeks passed, that anxiety diminished. Each time he let himself dress comfortably, he reminded himself that this was a facet of who he was, and that Sandra's willingness to support him spoke volumes about their relationship. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table, finishing a late meal, Sandra cleared her throat. "So, about that conversation we had, where I said I'd like to see you sometimes. Have you given it more thought?" He set down his fork and exhaled slowly. "I have. I'm just not sure how to do it without feeling overwhelmed." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "We can do it at your pace. There's no rush. I just want you to know the invitation is there." A nervous laugh escaped him. "You're amazing," he said, wincing at how clumsy his compliment sounded. I'm not trying to flatter you. I mean it. I didn't know how you'd react this second time." Sandra's eyes flickered with a trace of old hurt. "I was more surprised than upset, but I remember how difficult it was last time. I didn't handle it perfectly either. I think we're doing better now." Paul nodded, relief creeping into his posture. "We are." She squeezed his hand. "Then let's keep moving forward, okay? One step at a time." Over the next month, they developed a new sort of closeness. Sandra asked polite questions whenever she found a piece of clothing that seemed unfamiliar among the laundry or in the closet. Paul answered as best he could, describing how he found it, what appealed to him. Sometimes he'd slip into a comfortable tunic and leggings on a weekend afternoon while Sandra was reading in the next room. He wouldn't hide it from her, but he wouldn't flaunt it either, meeting her eyes if she walked by, offering a small nod that this was part of him. And in those moments, she would smile or offer a quiet wave, continuing with her own routine without making it awkward. Paul discovered that, oddly enough, the presence of the pet cam had led to this new stage of honesty. If not for that second accidental recording, they might still be locked in a pattern of half-truths. Now, they were inching toward more openness. It was not a rapid process, nor was it free of misunderstandings. Sometimes Paul would get defensive, sometimes Sandra would feel uneasy, but they worked through each challenge. One Saturday morning, Sandra was sorting through old boxes in their closet, looking for a missing photograph album. Paul was in the living room, sorting mail on the coffee table, humming a quiet tune. He heard Sandra call out, "Hey, found something of yours? Want me to bring it out?" Curious, he got up and headed into the bedroom. Sandra stood over a small chest, holding up a pair of glossy heels that Paul had stored there long ago and forgotten. She placed them gently on the bed. "These yours?" she asked, though it was clear from her expression she already knew the answer. He nodded, a little sheepish. "I forgot I even had those." Sandra ran a finger over the polished surface. "They're a nice pair. Your size, right?" He cleared his throat, trying not to feel self-conscious. "They are. I only wore them a couple of times. They're not exactly practical." A slight laugh escaped her. "Most fancy shoes aren't, trust me. The question is, do you want to keep them? If you do, you should probably store them properly. Otherwise, they'll just get ruined in a forgotten box." He hesitated, glancing at her face. She wasn't mocking him or scolding him. She was just being matter-of-fact. "I'd like to keep them," he finally said. "Maybe find a proper spot in the closet." She nodded, handed the shoes to him, and turned back to rummage for the photo album. Paul held the pair in his hands, marveling at how surreal it felt to speak openly about them with his wife. He carefully placed the heels on a shelf in the closet, making a mental note to buy a dust bag or a plastic container to keep them clean. He couldn't help but smile at how normal it all felt, as though they were simply reorganizing any other piece of clothing. A week later, it happened that Sandra had to go out of town for a quick 2-day work trip. Paul was left in charge of the house and Milo. On the second evening, around dinner time, Paul was cleaning up the kitchen when his phone chimed. He saw a text from Sandra. "Missing home. How's Milo?" He smiled and texted back. "He's good. Begged for extra treats, of course. How are you?" Their conversation continued in short bursts, with Sandra mentioning that she was bored in the hotel room and asking if Paul wouldn't mind turning on the pet cam so she could at least see Milo. "I know you're there, but I just want to peek at him," she wrote. Paul's breath caught for a moment, but he reminded himself that he was currently wearing jeans and a sweatshirt, nothing out of the ordinary. "No problem," he replied. He grabbed his phone, opened the app, and toggled the camera on. Soon, Sandra was sending him messages about how adorable Milo looked snoozing on the couch. After a few minutes, Paul decided to wave to her, figuring it might amuse her. He walked into the living room, right in the camera's field of view, and gave a playful wave. He pointed to Milo, who was curled up, and made a silly face that might make Sandra laugh if she was watching the feed. His phone buzzed a second later. "Ha ha, thanks for that. It's nice seeing you guys. Makes me miss home even more." He felt a warmth in his chest, the good kind. "We miss you too," he texted back. He lingered on the thought that just a month or two ago, this entire scenario would have filled him with dread. Now, it was simply an evening at home, with the camera turned on, and he wasn't terrified of being discovered or judged. Once Sandra ended the feed, Paul powered off the camera. He realized that this step might be their new normal, a camera that existed primarily for Milo, but one that could provide remote glimpses of home life for either of them. He was growing more comfortable knowing it was there, especially now that he and Sandra had guidelines in place. When Sandra returned the next day, they exchanged a warm hug at the door, Milo circling around their feet, tail wagging excitedly. She breathed in the familiar scent of home and gave Paul a playful nudge with her shoulder. "Thanks for letting me check in," she said. "It helped me not feel so isolated in that stuffy hotel." "Anytime," he replied, returning her smile. In that moment, he felt a tangible sense of closeness with her, one that transcended the earlier anxiety. Over dinner, they caught each other up on their respective days. Sandra recounted the details of her work meetings, how they had gone more smoothly than expected. Then she added with a grin, "I also might have slipped away to do a little bit of shopping during the break." Paul arched an eyebrow teasingly. "Another scarf?" She shook her head, eyes shining with mischief. "You'll see." She dug into her overnight bag and pulled out a small wrapped package. Carefully unwrapping it, she revealed a loose-fitting drapey tunic in a shade of soft charcoal. "It's pretty unisex, but I saw it and thought, maybe you'd like it?" Paul's breath caught. He ran his fingers across the fabric, feeling a sense of wonder that she'd pick out something specifically for him, acknowledging his style choices so openly. "Thank you," he said, his voice a bit shaky. "That's really thoughtful." She shrugged, but he could see she was pleased he liked it. "No big deal. I'm just glad I guessed the right size." He carefully set the tunic aside, determined not to let his emotions overwhelm him. He was deeply moved by her gesture, the practicality of it, and the acceptance behind it. They finished dinner in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. That evening, after they'd put away leftovers, fed Milo, and checked that the pet cam was off for the night, Sandra hesitated in the hallway. She observed Paul standing by the laundry basket, rummaging for something. Then she spoke up, voice soft. "Would you mind trying on that tunic now, so I can see how it fits?" Paul's cheeks warmed. He glanced at her, searching for any sign of discomfort. Instead, he saw only a gentle curiosity. "Sure," he said, a little nervously. "Let me grab a pair of leggings or something." She waited in the living room while he changed in the bedroom. The tunic slipped on easily, the fabric cool and light. He caught his reflection in the mirror, adjusting the drape of the sleeves. His heart beat faster. This was the first time Sandra had asked to see him in something that aligned more with Paula's style. He stepped out of the bedroom, smoothing the tunic. Sandra was sitting on the sofa, her legs curled beneath her, phone resting on the cushion. When she saw him, she took a second, quietly assessing. A slow smile spread across her face. "It looks good on you," she said. He swallowed hard, aware of a flush creeping up his neck. "Thanks," he murmured, shuffling awkwardly. He didn't know what to do with his hands. Should he model it for her? Stand still? He opted for a half turn so she could see the fit from the side. "Does it look all right?" She nodded. "It really does." She patted the space next to her. He sat down, careful to keep some distance in case she felt uncomfortable, but Sandra simply inched closer. "I'm glad you like it. I was nervous you'd think it was too bold for me to pick out clothes for you." He shook his head. "Bold, maybe, but in a good way. I'm grateful, really." They fell into a companionable silence, both gazing at the fabric, at each other, and occasionally at Milo as he settled in a corner. Then Sandra lifted her phone from the cushion, pressing the power button. "I know this might sound silly," she said with a small laugh, "but do you mind if I take a quick picture, just for me?" He felt a prickle of apprehension. A picture was so permanent, but he also recognized the sincerity in her request. "I guess that's okay," he said, forcing a small, shaky smile. "As long as it doesn't get posted anywhere. I'm not ready for that." She placed a reassuring hand on his knee. "Of course not, just for me." She opened the camera app and he tried to relax, turning slightly toward the lens. She snapped one quick photo, then showed it to him. "Look good?" He studied the image. He saw himself wearing a tunic that flowed across his frame, a slight blush on his cheeks. His posture looked tentative, but not entirely stiff. He noticed that his expression was softer than usual, as if a bit of a weight had lifted from him. It wasn't perfect, but it felt real. "It's fine," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Better than I expected." Sandra locked her phone, tucking it away. "Thank you," she said simply. She gave him a warm look that made him feel cherished. "I really appreciate this, Paul." He breathed, feeling like a door had opened, a door to a place where he didn't have to hide. He gently reached for her hand, and they shared a quiet moment of closeness on the couch. Milo let out a contented sigh from across the room. The house felt peaceful. In the weeks that followed, their marriage settled into a new rhythm. They didn't talk about the cross-dressing element every day, but it was always there, an open topic instead of a fearful secret. The second accidental recording, though humiliating at the time, had propelled them into a deeper level of honesty. Paul sometimes found himself wearing the plum top or the leggings while Sandra was cooking dinner. She might cast him a brief, knowing smile, but often she'd simply continue stirring a pot or chopping vegetables, as though it were as normal as anything else. And in some ways, it was starting to feel that way. On the day that Sandra decided to thoroughly check the pet cam settings, Paul stood behind her, calmly observing. Together they went through the motion of setting new passcodes, adjusting the sensitivity so it wouldn't record every time Milo wandered by. They tested the microphone, confirming that Sandra could call out Milo's name from her phone if needed. Throughout the entire process, Paul did not flinch. When the feed showed his own reflection in the TV screen's glossy surface, he felt only a mild jolt. He thought back to the first time he'd discovered Sandra had seen him on camera, and to the second time, which had felt like a different kind of heartbreak. Yet here he was now, standing beside her, secure in the knowledge that she would not use it to corner him or shame him. When they finished, Sandra turned to him with a thoughtful tilt of her head. "I know we put this camera in for Milo," she said with a hint of a grin, "but it sure has done a lot more than just let us watch our anxious dog." Paul gave a rueful chuckle. "Yeah, it's been quite the catalyst, hasn't it?" She nodded. "Sometimes good things come out of messy beginnings." Paul caught her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "I still get nervous," he admitted. "That feeling doesn't vanish overnight, but we're finding our way." She squeezed back, letting the weight of his words settle. "I'm right here," she assured him. They ended that day on the sofa, with Paul wearing the new charcoal tunic and a pair of comfortable lounge pants. Milo snored gently at their feet. Paul and Sandra watched an old comedy series they both enjoyed, sharing laughter and relaxed conversation. As Paul leaned back against a throw pillow, He glanced at the small camera perched discreetly on the lower shelf. Its light was off, its lens reflecting just a glimmer of the lamplight. No more fear, no more guilt gnawing at him. Instead, he felt a deeper sense of understanding, an understanding that he and Sandra had approached an unspoken threshold together and had chosen to cross it. The air felt lighter, and the evening felt calm. When the show ended, Sandra turned to face him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I'm proud of us," she whispered. "I really am." Paul felt warmth bloom in his chest. He wrapped an arm around her. "Me too," he said. They were small words for what he felt, but they carried enough weight in that moment. They sat in silence for a while, savoring the comfort they had created in the wake of two unexpected camera incidents. Their situation wasn't traditional or tidy, and it didn't have a neat, polished label, but it was real. They had made space for all sides of Paul's identity, and Sandra had shown she wasn't going to run from it. That alone was worth the awkwardness and the second accidental reveal. Eventually, they rose from the sofa, turned off the lights, and coaxed Milo to his dog bed. The quiet hush of the house enveloped them. As they settled in for the night, Paul felt the tension of the last few months lose its grip on him. Sandra reached for his hand under the covers, and he intertwined his fingers with hers. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves in the yard. Tomorrow would bring new routines, new tasks, and perhaps new challenges. But for now, he closed his eyes, allowing himself the small but profound relief of knowing that he could wake up the next day in a home where he no longer felt the urge to hide his clothing or his sense of self. The reminder of the camera was there, but it had become a tool rather than a threat. He drifted off to sleep, grateful that the second time he'd been caught on camera had not ended in disaster, but in a pathway to deeper closeness. And for all the tension and worry, it felt like a transformation, quiet, unplanned, and surprisingly comforting.
Did you like the story? Hit that like button and tell me what you thought in the comments. Do you want to hear more stories? Subscribe and hit the bell. For exclusive content and early access, check out our Patreon. You can find the link in the description, or you can watch any of the videos shown on my right. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.